As a result of the sermon this morning, when we talked about the main message and the only message, the only focus of the church, the main mission and only mission is preaching the gospel. And as we look back throughout church history, we see how many times they would lose that sense of mission. It would be changed, it would be altered, they'd slip off into things typically because of covetousness and people trying to seek power. So if you've ever been in a church where you see a power play going on, which happens, what you've got is something that's happened forever because that's the way people are. And I think of especially the memory of our dear brother Luke Heza was a very businessman. He was did a lot of business in the world, let's say. But he also, I guess, because of that, he had a sense of cynicism that I think is really kind of appropriate. That says, "Yeah," that I'm quoting Lou right now. Just do it. Just go ahead. My vote is yes. Whatever you say, vote yes." Because so many things are really kind of commonsensical, and it's only when people get where they're really trying to be all officious and which goes along with having a sense of power, that's where you get problems like that. But a lot of stuff with Christianity really is very simple, and part of it is if you had that main focus, that mission focus of wanting to get people saved. If that consumes us, then we're like all we are all things to all men, that by all means we might win others and not sin. We might win others. Okay, so that's our focus. Okay, so we're coming up to this time in the late Middle Ages now. Things are about to bust wide open uh, with the Reformation. We're coming to the end, getting ready to go into the Reformation time. Now, as we go into the Reformation time, would you like to guess what the main problem was that they were going into the Reformation with? It's very related to the morning sermon. The gospel, preaching the gospel. Okay. See, this is what it all comes down to is if you get the wrong focus, the wrong mission, uh, that's what's going to that's what it's going to detract from is the preaching of the gospel. So you get back to the preaching of the gospel and it will pull you in line. My thing to say to people is you should go out and try to articulate the gospel to somebody. By articulating means you go to explain it. It's at those times when you find out what you don't know. Okay, because you sort of know it and you really kind of know it, but then all of a sudden you say, and it just goes off that way. So in fact, Jaden, you had a nice experience of that, I trust, on Thursday night. Okay, yeah, trying to actually say things out is, yeah, it's kind of revealing, right? Yeah, praise God. Okay, so we make up for that. Okay, so yeah, when you're preaching the gospel and you're trying to explain things, you're explaining the most important things, and you got people with 50 different kinds of takes on things for what they think the gospel is or what salvation is. And I mean 50 different takes, 50 different theological takes. You got to be able to answer all of those. And to be able to do that, you got to study and you become very clear in your message then. And boy, are you having a honed message then, Miss Nancy.
Yes, all very true. It's just that when we take into account the God factor, he
Yes.
knew that the woman of the well saved 5 minutes. She couldn't wait to go and tell others what Christ had done for her.
Yeah.
She had not had the chance yet to study or to learn all the right responses, but she was going to tell everybody about Christ. And many of them came to Christ after that and said, well, first we came because of what she said. Now we hear you and we ourselves are going to believe based on what we've heard for ourselves. And God knows each person that we are going to talk to, whether or not we know all the answers. So while he's training us talking to people, he's also sending just the right people whose heart he's prepared, because they need, as Joe often says, that pebble in their shoe. or seed, or maybe watering from a previous seed or something. So none of that should frighten us from witnessing. Oh, I don't know enough. And what if they say this? And what if they ask that? I don't know. You know, I have found when I've said to people, I'm going to make it my business to find out. And then I just steer them back to the simple plan of salvation, because some of them have, well, what about this looks like a contradiction? Or where did Cain get his wife? Or all of these things that,
Yeah.
now I've heard those things thousands of times. But when I was a new believer, I knew what Christ did for me. And that's all you need to start witnessing.
Yeah.
Because you can
Let
tell
me
them.
emphasize that and back up. Yes, I think you should know the 50 different theological positions so you can talk to people. However, what Nancy's pointing out is what you start off with is what happened to you. If you can describe what happened to you, you want to remember also that the Holy Spirit is involved in all of this. Okay. I want to know those 50 theological positions because I want to really try to do my best to get it out there. But the only thing that gets out there is what the Holy Spirit blesses. So yeah, if you can start off with saying, here's what I did, that is a most excellent place to start. Yeah. Does that capture what you were saying?
Yeah, I think it's just so important not to be frightened to share the gospel.
Right.
Many years ago, there were two ladies in the church that went out together, and they came upon a Christian's, well, said he was a Christian anyway,
Mhm.
and he was an old guy who thought he knew quite a bit. So he had a very dim view of them going door to door to preach the gospel. So he really started putting out all of these deep theological questions for them, and they really didn't know what to say. And he said, "You know nothing. You have no business going door to door." And that really discouraged them.
Uh,
And they were so, they were a combination of embarrassed and afraid. Um, and it took a long time for us to talk them off their ledge and say, no, no, God wants you to tell people about Christ. You don't have to know, you don't have to have like extensive Bible training and all kinds of degrees. You just tell them what Christ did for you,
yeah.
and that God will be pleased with you and bless you with more knowledge as you go. Because after years of doing it, you do get used to hearing the same questions, and you can have patience in answering, like, well, I know where you're coming from. I used to ask that same thing, or here's what the Bible says, or here's what science has shown. And you're not as intimidated as you used to be because you do have a little bit more experience.
Yeah.
But you can't get the experience without the experience.
Yeah.
So you
And
just have to do it.
when he said you have no business going out, I want to say, no, that's the only business.
Exactly.
And um, quite frankly, when you have somebody with an attitude like that, and if you do have the answers for him, he's still going to say the same thing. Okay, because the problem is with the heart, not with the knowledge. So yeah, yeah. So just get out there and let God work in whatever way God will. And I could see it happening just the opposite. If somebody didn't know something, somebody could say, wow, they didn't know anything. I better go find this out for myself. Okay. They won't, because you see, they're in rebellion against God. Okay. But if they were honest before God, they'd say, wow, I guess other people have problems. I better find out myself. Okay.
I
So
I
yes.
also feel like uh, God sends us people, like He sent me my washing machine repairman.
Yeah.
He sent just the right question or the right comment. Oh, what denomination are you? It's as though the Holy Spirit just put it right out there, and for me to answer, like the Bible says, be ready to answer for
Yeah.
those who give for those who ask us a question about the hope that is within us. And
Yes.
that's how I felt, and I do pray for that gentleman to be saved.
Oh yeah. And that kind of thing, we've seen a little bit of that going on lately, like um when Elijah John asked Joe and Maya, what about Calvinism and Arminianism, or Calvinism? Just Calvinism. Nobody knows to ask that. Brother Tone and I had the lady yesterday, um, and she said, what do you think about once saved, always saved? And I thought, well, I got a whole sermon to preach here about it. We shared as much as we could. Nobody knows to ask that kind of question. Nobody knows to say, what denomination are you? A little bit more, but yeah. So sometimes you get these very interesting questions, and then we're just, like Donna said, we're just ready to give an answer for the hope that lieth in us. Okay. I am on page 170 in our book. And tomorrow I should mention to you that I'm going to try to send you a link somehow, because the book that we use, the the notes on church history, lessons in church history, it is also available online. The entire book is also available online as well, and so you can look at that. I'll send you a link for that. Okay, so we looked at, as we're coming up at the end of the age, there were those who paved the way for the Reformation. We had the dissenting churches. We saw about them the Paulicians, Petrobrusians, the Cathari, the Henricians, the Waldensians. And these were churches that were pretty much just flat out independent of the state church. Then we had the early reformers that we had talked about, including certain papal efforts for trying to bring about reform. They saw some problems in the church, and they tried to have some reforms going. Then we come up to uh, John Wycliffe. We saw the video about him, and he was a pre-reformer. He never left the Catholic Church. He was still a state church person, but his work was really making a difference, because this was an effort to get the Bible into the people's hands, that they would translate the Bible into the vulgar tongue, which is always fun to point out because people say, I don't believe in being vulgar. Oh, that's so vulgar. Now, the word vulgar means common. And so it's come to, because of people's bad language, their cursings and everything like that, that's their common language. Okay. But uh, getting it translated into English and then in German, when Luther took that up, now you're getting to where they're getting away from Latin. Just as the Greek language had fallen out of use in the Roman Empire by about 400 AD, and Jerome introduced the Latin translation. Well, now the Latin translations are not doing any good. People can't read those. So now is the need for the common language Bibles. Yes.
I was just going to ask, is that where the term Vulgate comes from?
Exactly, from common language. The Jerome's Latin, well, it was common then. The Latin was common then. Okay, but by Wycliffe's time, it is no longer common. And I see a chat. Okay, there you go. Yes. Okay, so now you get Wycliffe dies off. He's dying off, and his let's see. This paves the way for John Huss. John Huss was influenced by Wycliffe. Yes.
I just have a side question. And I was reminded of this morning when you used the Latin expression in the sermon. And it occurs to me that a lot of people who are reformed in their theology will throw around these Latin expressions. Why would they do that? Because that looks like they have some sort of allegiance to the Latin Bible, or I know that they think that it sounds very sophisticated. Why don't they use Greek?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question I have. So I'd like to say, well, I want to go back to the Greek. And so there was a time when I would quote Greek stuff.
Like what? I don't get that.
Okay, what was happening, and we'll be repeating this all later on. As the Reformation was going on, they were not just leaving the Catholic Church. They were only trying to reform it. So they started off with a few reforms, and then they grew with more reforms. So they were just sort of gradually coming out. Now, in their mindset, they were still thinking in terms of a universal church. This is why I went over that thing. I guess it was on a Sunday morning there. I talked about how that some people have a sense of the universal visible church, meaning that the church was visible on the earth and it was one church over all the earth. Okay, so that would be the Catholic Church. They had the state church. So it was universal and it was visible. The reformers came along and they said, if we got this visible thing going on, that gives the Pope some power to be able to claim that he's the head over everything. I know we believe that all the believers are still united as a universal church, but we're going to get rid of the visible aspect. We're going to say the invisible church, all the believers that we can't see, and Jesus Christ, who we can't see also, he's over his church. They thought that was the remedy. So they were still carrying on the officialness from the old universal church. They still carried on that officialness into the new universal church. And so their theology was being done in Latin. Remember, they were all, the church leaders were all Latin speaking and producing their theological works in Latin. So they kept that Latin. Now, Baptist groups and other groups that are like Baptists, what they said was, no. Reformers, you corrected the wrong word. Instead of correcting the word visible, we want to keep the word visible. We want to get rid of the word universal. We believe in the local visible church. Okay, like I see you, you are visible, and you at home, I can see that you're online. Okay, I can sort of see you. Okay, so we're visible, but it's only in a local area. We don't need all the officialness of the state high church. We're going to go with more common language. Therefore, we're going to speak in English because we're all struggling here to speak in English. I was going to say we're all speaking English, but I remember we're in the New York metropolitan area, and so we're either speaking in English or trying to speak in English. So we're going to use English terms. So what they were trying to do by keeping the Latin was it was just a holdover, like infant baptism, like having a hierarchy. They sort of held on to those things, like their teachings on the end times. That was sort of coming on down to them from the Catholic Church, along with Latin phrases. And so when you were using Latin phrases, you sounded like you were an educated person because you went to the university where they taught the Latin.
That would explain why they used those things then. I just don't understand why Calvinists love to use Latin phrases today. I mean, they understand about the different Bibles and they understand about Romans.
Well, those Latin phrases and all that mentality lasted from 1500 to about, let's say, nearly 1800, nearly like 300 years of that dominance. So that's why they would keep that. They were so used to it, and they were so. Now you got 300 years of them being of this kind of Latin stuff being entrenched. You come up to the American Revolution, where now you've got that's going to be a fun time to go through. Where you've got not just a revolution between us and England, but a theological revolution, a church revolution, where now the local churches can thrive. So this is just a bad habit, a sequined nun's hat. No, bad habit. Okay, this is just a bad habit that's left over from Catholicism. Yeah, Brother Tone, microphone. Brother Joe, microphone. Oh, behind you. Oh, somebody. Okay, thank you.
Luther did translate the Bible into German.
Yes.
From which version did he translate, the Latin or the Greek?
I think it was the Greek. I'd have to. It's in the book. I'd have to look it up. Okay, but when as the movie's going, I'll go and look up, because I have a list, I believe, of Bibles that were taken from Greek and some taken from Latin, but very possible from Greek for him. Okay, so We got just enough time for this video, about half an hour long. What we're going to see now is John Hus. He's in Czechoslovakia. And he is going to be greatly influenced by the ideas of Wycliffe. He and Wycliffe are going to end up being an influence on somebody yet to come, Martin Luther. Martin Luther is going to have the printing press available to him, and he's going to have the state backing amongst the German princes. And with that perfect storm brewing, they're going to really launch out at that time. So this is all pre-reformers then that we're looking at now. So let me oh yeah, and Magna Carta. Be ready to give some nice comments, because that's right up your alley, the Magna Carta. Not today, but when we get there. I'll have you prepare now. Okay, let's find my video. There we go. This is John Hus. On a second, I got to change my speakers.
If you were to go to the city of Prague today and go to the town square of the old port of the city, you would see standing right in the middle a bit of an interesting statue. You see a group of figures clumped together, and out in front you actually see a solitary figure who is leaning forward, looking out over the city square and in some ways looking towards the great church right there in the middle of the town square. That statue, though many tourists don't recognize it, is a statue to Jan Hus. And in this lecture, we're going to look at Jan Hus, and we're going to talk about his reform movement in the area of Bavaria, which is in the modern-day Czech Republic. Jan Hus is an interesting figure. Many have looked to him, particularly in the Protestant world, not because he is valuable on his own, though he is certainly very interesting, and his theology is certainly worth considering from the Protestant perspective. But in 1519, just as Luther's Reformation was underway, he went to Leipzig to have a disputation with the man who would become his nemesis, Eck. And it was there at Leipzig that Luther famously said, out loud for really the first time, Ja, ich bin Hussite, which is German for, yes, I am a Hussite. And the stories we have of the Leipzig disputation tells us that the room really went into pandemonium as a result of Luther uttering these words. We are to believe that so abhorrent is the idea of being a Hussite that when Luther is willing to identify himself with the Hussite movement, that the pious in the audience are taken aback. Well, who was Jan Hus? Jan Hus was a preacher, an academic, the instigator of a religious movement, and he was a forerunner to the Reformation. And just as in the last lecture, as we looked at the writings and the life of John Wycliffe in England, Jan Hus sort of stands in this late medieval tradition of challenging not just the authority of the papacy or the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, but he actually attacks the theological foundations of the Church that even support the papacy or any of the other doctrines of the Middle Ages. Jan Hus was born around 1372. He is, again, very much a late medieval man. And Jan Hus is a humble man. He grows up as just a man of the fields. He's not really all that wealthy. He's not even close to middle class. The city of his birth is actually where he gets his name. The city Husinec actually means goose town, and lots of historians have had a little bit of fun making fun of the fact that Jan Hus really just sort of means Jan the goose. But it was a farming town. It was a livestock town. Hus was very much a man of the people, and the fact that he comes from the everyday stock of the Czech people is actually one of the reasons why even down until today, His statue stands in the middle of Prague as a symbol of Czech national loyalty. And Hus tells us that though he grew up in relatively meager means, that he actually pursued the priesthood, not, he tells us, because he wanted to achieve any degree of moral sanctity, or that he wanted to save his soul, or that he had a burden for the people. Rather, he tells us he began to pursue the priesthood because he wanted to have a bit of an easy life. He thought it would give him a bit more attention and fame, and that it would be a way out of a life of goose raising, I suppose. And so in 1390, Jan enrolls at the University of Prague. And the University of Prague really becomes the microcosm of what Jan Hus's Reformation is going to be driven by. At this time, what we today call the Czech Republic was known then as the country of Bohemia. And Bohemia was part of the Holy Roman Empire, that great, vast terrain of elected leadership that was owned for long periods of time by the German peoples. To be the ruler of Germany often meant that you were the Holy Roman Emperor. And Bohemia at this time was ruled by the actual brother of the Holy Roman Emperor. The Holy Roman Emperor was Sigismund, and his brother at the time was head of Bohemia. And being of German stock and seeing Bohemia essentially as another part of the German Empire, the University of Prague became embroiled in many ways in a struggle between the locals, the Czech locals, and the German influence from the Holy Roman Empire that was coming to bear on the University of Prague. We know that there were 4 sub-factions of nationalities there present at the university, and only one of the 4 was actually Czech. We also know that amongst the faculty, it was heavily German. German scholars outweighed other faculty and Czech faculty by sometimes as many as 3 to 1. That number ebbed and flowed. But for the Czech students who were part of the university, they saw the University of Prague as their own. And in fact, Czech students numbered about 50% of the student body. So you can only imagine 50% or slightly more than 50% are Czech, but the faculty is overwhelmingly German, and the focus and the attention was always going towards the German perspective on life and theology, etc. And Hus took his degrees just as the 1300s were coming to a close. He received a BA, and then he received an MA, and we are told that around the year 1400 he is actually finally ordained. He begins to study for his doctorate. He never finished the process of studying for his doctorate. And really the reason he didn't complete his doctoral work is because very quickly Jan Hus was a rising star as a Czech member of the university. In 1402, he is actually named the preacher of the Bethlehem Chapel there in Prague. You can actually still go and see the Bethlehem Chapel to this day. And Jan Hus filled a role that a lot of major urban cities in medieval Europe had, and that was to be a pastor to the lay people. Zwingli, later in the Reformation, fills the same role when he's a Leutpriester. He was a preacher that would preach lay sermons in German, as Zwingli would, to all of the people in Zurich. And Jan Hus is doing the same here in Prague. His job was to preach sermons in Czech to the people, and he drew large audiences that people found his preaching to be inspiring as well as biblical, and that he was a bit of a beacon of hope for the Czech students and for all those who held out the belief that a Czech university, the University of Prague, should be run by Czechs. And here was Jan Hus, a scholar and a preacher who was every bit the epitome of what they wanted. And for whatever reason, whether it is the nationalism of the Czech students or the natural affinity of some of these students to heretical ideas, at some point in the early 1400s, we see a pretty strong rise in interest amongst the students in the teachings of John Wycliffe. Of course, Wycliffe was dead by now, and historians are a bit divided on this. Some believe that it was the tension politically between the Germans and the Czech that caused the Czech to suddenly begin devoting attention to the writings of John Wycliffe. But we have to acknowledge that there is some theological affinity between the biblical vernacular preaching that Jan Hus was doing to the masses, to those gathered in Prague, and the call by Wycliffe to preach biblically, to focus on the message of Scripture, and to rely less and less on some of the theological system of the medieval world. At some point, on or around 1408 or 1409, Jan Hus finally runs afoul of the local archbishop there in Prague. And the Archbishop of Prague actually condemns some of the teachings of Jan Hus. And it would seem that Jan Hus himself was a follower of John Wycliffe, though he was not entirely devoted to everything that Wycliffe taught. And in fact, he was developing some of his own ideas about reform. Whatever the case, finally in 1409, the Pisan Pope, that is, the Pope who was in Pisa during the Great Papal Schism, so only one of the three, but the Pisan Pope actually sides against Jan Hus. Now, for all we can tell, this seems to be really focused on the teachings of John Wycliffe. It doesn't seem to be per se that they were going after Jan Hus because he was Czech, or that they were going after Jan Hus because he was so overtly a heretic at this point that he needed to be slapped down. Rather, it was the fact that the Wycliffe movement, as we saw in the last lecture, was beginning to gain steam, and that it wasn't dying out, and that it was actually beginning to gain some traction with the Lollards in England, that likely led the Pisan Pope to try to slap it down in Bohemia before it ever got started. And then to back matters up, the Archbishop of Prague again comes and excommunicates Jan Hus just after the Pope has condemned him. Now, this is an interesting point. Hus, at this point, is excommunicated for disobedience. In other words, he is not yet declared to be a heretic. And we should remember that in the Middle Ages, you could be excommunicated for a lot of things. Often the belief was that excommunication was a warning, at least at the first step, particularly for lesser problems. The church never really believed that excommunication was a permanent fixture, that you were now consigned to hell forever, though of course if you died while under excommunication, you would actually spend eternity in hell and not even be afforded the rights to go to purgatory and work your way finally up to heaven. But Hus is excommunicated, and it's telling that he's excommunicated for disobedience to the papacy, that he will not submit to the ruling and the authority of the Archbishop of Prague. All of this, in other words, seems to be done in order to bring Jan Hus to heel, to take the Czech voice and bring him down so that Bohemia can achieve a level of equilibrium. The problem with this, of course, as with any reaction of this kind, both then and now, is as soon as you condemn something without giving it a full chance to be heard, you ultimately propel either that person or that book or that idea onto the world stage. And that's exactly what happened with Jan Hus. To now be declared excommunicated and to have some of his teachings condemned now meant that quite a few, particularly those in Bohemia, the Czech locals, began to look at Jan Hus's teachings with new, fresh energy. And it's actually telling that the goal of the Archbishop of Prague was not necessarily to kill Jan Hus as soon as possible, because even after being excommunicated, Jan Hus still takes the pulpit at the Bethlehem Chapel there in Prague, and he still preaches his message, just like Luther, who would be condemned about 100 years later. And only after Luther was condemned did he begin to really bolster his language and strengthen it to show what he truly believed about justification. Jan Hus does the exact same thing. Now that he's condemned, now that he's excommunicated, his preaching actually takes on a new inflammatory tone, both against the leadership in Prague as well as the papacy itself. And all of this came to a head in 1411 when the Pope issued another crusading indulgence, that is, another indulgence designed to give lay people a plenary indulgence, that is to say, a full indulgence for all sins committed, for all of the penance that you owed to the Catholic Church in order to escape purgatory and find your way directly to heaven after death. And the indulgence sale in late medieval Europe is increasingly viewed with some suspicion, if not hostility. Most people believed and assumed, and rightly so in many cases, that the crusading indulgences, that the full plenary indulgences that were sold, were not sold so much for the care or the concern of the spiritual well-being of the lay people throughout Europe, but rather they were sold so that those in power could recoup some financial reward and could then apply the funds to whatever project or whatever crusade that they needed funds for. It's with the rise of the sale of indulgences in 1411 that Jan Hus begins to attack the sale of indulgences themselves. Now, again, this sounds very much like Luther just 100 years later. In fact, one of the comments that Jan Hus makes at this point is identical to one that Luther will make 100 years later. Jan Hus points out the fact that if the papacy actually has power over purgatory, and if the papacy can, according to its power, release those who are suffering in purgatory so that they might move on to heaven, why, Jan Hus asks, are we charging money for this? If you have the power, why don't you just simply do it? In fact, that very argument shows up specifically in the 95 Theses with Luther. It seems to have become a bit of a scandalous comment to make about the papacy, which is if you have the power, why are you charging us money for it? That seems extortionate. Jan Hus is excommunicated again. This time it is certainly for the sake of declaring him to be a heretic, to attack indulgences, which is one of the main revenue sources for those in power in the Catholic Church at this time, is, again, just like Luther, to incur some severe wrath from those in power. But Jan Hus was not alone. As his preaching had spread, and as his role as a Czech national who was standing up against those who were in power, both in Rome and in Germany, there actually arose a large number of people who became followers of Hus. We actually see that there were a number of people who began to riot about the sale of indulgences, began to stir up trouble, particularly in Prague. And to Hus's dismay, the sedition was put down, and many of those who had participated in the uprising were beheaded. And Hus at this point decides that he is too much of a firebrand, that his role in Prague is too volatile, and that he does not want to see bloodshed occur because of his name anymore. And so he decides that it is best that he leave his post at the Bethlehem Chapel and move on and go throughout the countryside as opposed to staying in Prague. And that as he goes throughout the countryside, that he will begin to preach and teach and connect with the hoi polloi, the average person out there in the surrounding environs of Bohemia. And again, the harsh tactics with which the Catholic Church attempted to suppress Hus and his followers only began to propel the name of Jan Hus and his followers, who are now increasingly being called the Hussites. It only propelled them further on to the national stage as well as the international stage. As Hus travels, he finds sympathy, he finds supporters. And then as he preaches and makes connections in the surrounding regions of Bohemia, the movement begins to catch fire. It's also while Hus is traveling that he writes his most famous book, which is De Ecclesia, which is translated as On the Church. And in De Ecclesia, Jan Hus lays out some of his vision for what the church ought to be, on the biblical foundation of how the church ought to be run, as well as his view on the sacraments and other doctrines. And it's at this point that we can really notice one of the main doctrines that Jan Hus taught and defended that actually sets him apart from Wycliffe. We noticed in the last lecture that Wycliffe actually still believes in the physical presence of Christ in the Eucharist. The thing that Wycliffe denied was that it was transubstantiated. For Hus, it wasn't so much the physical presence of Christ or the morality or the ethical virtue of the one offering the bread and wine. Rather, for Hus, it was something different. It was actually who gets the wine. You see, in the late Middle Ages, over time, the church had decided that the cup needed to be withheld from the laity. Those of you raised Catholic, or those of you who are aware of even modern-day Catholic practice, will know that the Mass does not have the wine for lay folks. If you come forward and you're Catholic and you're there for the Mass, you only get the wafer. The cup is reserved, as they say, only for the priesthood. And there are lots of rationales for this. Some are somewhat urban legends. The rise of this idea appears to have come from a number of different avenues. First and foremost, there does seem to be an idea that the cup is more holy. There's something about the blood element of the wine that caused some to see it as a deeper holiness than even the bread and the body of Christ. There are other comments that are made, though, that the wine was at times spilled, or that it was mistreated, that it somehow was unsafe to place a cup of wine even just on the lips of a layperson. And so the theological rationale, the theological argument of keeping the cup away from the laity was a logical deduction, and that logical deduction was that a body has blood in it as well, and therefore if you give the body to the layperson, you're giving them a little bit of blood as well. Therefore, they are getting both technically, and therefore we can reserve the cup just for the priests. This issue of keeping the cup from the laity is a theological issue for Hus, but it's also symbolic of the things that Hus was standing against. The idea of new traditions, the idea that the clergy is superior to the laity, or that they have sacraments that are just for them, and that the laity just have to only get half of the Lord's Supper or the Mass. And so the view that becomes associated with Jan Hus is called the Utraquist heresy. Utraquist derives from the Latin, which means both. It just means that we want both elements, bread and wine, at the Mass. And so at the end of the day, you have Jan Hus, who is both a national, he very much sees himself as a Czech, as someone who is standing up for the people of his nation, that he wants Bohemia to have its own church, to not be governed by other people, whether it's the Holy Roman Empire or the Pope in Rome. Still, Hus was not the power player in the relationship. And in fact, the Holy Roman Emperor finally got sick and tired of this heretical nuisance in Bohemia, and he called for Jan Hus to come to a council that was being called in 1415, called the Council of Constance. Now, we've already looked at the Council of Constance when we looked at the Papal Schism. Of course, the Council of Constance is the very council where the schism was healed and the Catholic Church was restored. Well, it's also at this council that Jan Hus comes to stand trial. Hus knew what he was up against. The council was going to be hostile. Hus was already excommunicated, he was already condemned, and he was increasingly volatile in his beliefs. And certainly the Utraquist heresy is one of those heresies that the Catholic Church was just not going to hear any debate on. And the Holy Roman Emperor, Sigismund, attempts to offer Jan Hus what's called a safe conduct passage. And a safe conduct passage is a document that an emperor will give somebody or a ruler will give somebody that says, yes, I want to kill you, frankly, but if you come to this event and meet with me, I promise that your life will not be in jeopardy on the way, and often it would be negotiated that on the way back, your life would not be in jeopardy either. Hus decided to take the emperor at his word, and he decided to leave Bohemia before the safe conduct document arrived. He heads to the Council of Constance and he arrives, and shortly after he arrives, the safe conduct does arrive, and unfortunately it wasn't as complete as Jan Hus had requested. So, for example, the safe conduct does not say at any point that Hus will be allowed to defend himself, or that he will be allowed to address the council. It also denied that he would be allowed safe conduct back to Bohemia. Now, the verdict of history on this has always sided with Hus and not with Sigismund. To give a safe conduct passage is only halfway good, that only gives you safe conduct on the way there, but not on the way back, just means that as soon as you set foot heading back, they can just sort of immediately arrest you just outside the city gates, hypothetically at least. Or they could send a band of brigands to sort of off you on the road on the way back. You needed safe conduct both ways for it to even be safe conduct. And so people have always excoriated Sigismund and the Council of Constance for breaking at least the good faith of a safe conduct passage. People were always shocked when Luther is on trial before the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. And Charles V has given Luther a safe conduct passage. And Luther thinks, just like Jan Hus, it's not worth the paper it's written on. And sure enough, Charles V says, no, you can go back. I'm not going to arrest you now. I'll come for you later. And people always sort of scratch their head. It's, you had him, you had him in your hands. Why'd you let him go? But almost certainly there does seem to be some concern by Charles V that he not live down to the legacy of Sigismund in the Catholic Church in the 15th century, who offered safe conduct to a heretic and didn't abide by it. And for Hus, within a month of him arriving at the council, he is arrested. He is not allowed to address the council, which could only have been expected. He is only asked to answer questions. So, for example, he would be asked, is this your teaching? Do you teach this? Is this what you believe? And in some cases, he said no, he did not believe in the things that were alleged to be his ideas. In other cases, though, he was very confident to say, yes, that is what I believe, and I'm willing to defend that. And of course, when you're facing a council and they're giving you the option to say, no, I do not, or that I recant, you really only have one option, either to say, no, I do not teach that, or I do not believe that, or to fully recant. To abide by any of these teachings at this point, Jan Hus knows, everyone knows, is to say that I am condemned, and what is going to happen to me is what you could expect. In July 1415, Hus is brought into the council, and one by one his priestly garments are stripped from him as they continue to ask him, will you recant? And the answer is no. Of course, this is the symbolic defrocking, which means you're literally removing the garments that signify his priestly or pastoral role as part of the church. And in 1415, condemned, excommunicated, recalcitrant, Jan Hus is burned at the stake at the Council of Constance. Now, if you think back to all of that preaching in the book that Hus wrote, and the followers that he attracted, and you play that into also the fact that this is a Czech national, a real hero for the Bohemian people, that has now been badly treated at least, if not lied to by the Holy Roman Emperor. What you have now is not just a spark, you have a powder keg that is now on fire and about to explode. And back in Bohemia, that is exactly what happens. The news that Jan Hus had been arrested and then defrocked and then finally burnt at the stake, that his ashes had been scooped up and thrown into the river so that none of his followers would be able to even bury his bones, was beyond the pale for many of Hus's followers. And as a result, they militarized. The Hussite League is formed shortly after the burning of Jan Hus. And in fact, they not only militarize, but they organize. They become a real strong movement that is both galvanized around this injustice that they believe is done to Jan Hus, but as well as around the theological ideas of Hus himself and the heresies that are associated with Wycliffe and other late medieval reformers. In fact, so pronounced is the threat of the Hussite League that in 1418 the Pope actually calls, now at this point of course it's the restored Martin V, now that the papal schism is ended. But in 1418 Martin V calls a crusade against the Hussites. And this, however, only leads to further rioting in the city of Prague. A year later, 1419, you have what's known as the defenestration of Prague, which is a bit of a play on words there, because defenestration literally means out the window. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. The Hussites stormed the main administrative building, they grabbed the rulers of the city, and they threw them out the window, and they died either by hitting the ground from a tall height, or the mob finished them off when they hit the ground and were maimed and wounded there. And the defenestration of Prague is considered one of these watershed moments for the Hussite Church, because it was the first time they stood up, not just theologically for themselves, but now politically. They stood up against these German rulers in the city of Prague who were trying to impose papal and traditional religion on them when they were not willing to accept it. And so good was the Hussite League at forming its own unity and organizing and at the tactics of war against those who were trying to suppress them, that actually the Hussites won, to the astonishment of everyone, historians included. In 1420, the Hussites win, and a certain level of peaceful cooperation is imposed on Bohemia, that from 1420 on, at least well into the 17th century, the Hussite movement continues, and it lives alongside the Catholic Church and Catholic adherence to the faith in the same country. And this is why there are many people who believe that Bohemia really is the first Protestant nation. It has seceded from the Catholic Church, this whole wing, and it achieves a level of recognition from the Catholic Church, who essentially realize at some point that they can devote all kinds of resources and troops in effort to suppress this heresy, but the more they try to suppress it, the quicker it grows. Now, one of the last things theologically to say about the Hussites is they were not united theologically. The very reality is that Jan Hus's theology was not actually all that well developed. His Utraquist beliefs did not really challenge or bring up anything about the doctrines of salvation. His attack on indulgences was more about, again, the abuse of indulgences than it was on the actual belief in whether or not indulgences were valid at all. Utraquism, in other words, is not really much to make a church out of. Once you have communion in both kinds, you still have to describe what it is, what it's there for, what its role is in salvation, and all these other doctrines that are significantly important for determining the belief of your church. And in fact, one of the first things to develop in the Hussite movement is you have a split theologically. In the Hussite church, the folks that would be called the Utraquist church are, by any account, the moderates. They are those who really adhere to Jan Hus directly, at least as a forerunner or figure to sort of inspire them. Their focus is on the Utraquism doctrines of communion in both kinds. They want churches that are autonomous in their own way, but they are moderate. Their goal is not to throw everything out that is Catholic, but rather to get the Catholic Church to get off their back. There's another group of Hussites, though, and they're called the Taborites. And the Taborites are an entirely different band of weirdos. The Taborites are what we call millenarian. They are hyper-eschatological. They take the name Tabor from the mountain in Israel where Christ is supposed to return when he comes back again. The Taborites focus a great deal on the second coming, on whether or not it's imminent, what will happen afterwards. And as is unfortunate with lots of millenarian movements, a lot of the activities and the beliefs and the actions of the Taborites just get a little strange. Actually, they don't get a little strange. They get a lot strange. They are, frankly, crazy. Let's just put it that way. At some point, they decide to practice what we might today call free love, the sharing of partners. They were communist in the modern sense of the word. They wanted to share everything. They didn't want to share their own goods. They wanted everyone else's goods to be shared as well. And that was one of their main rallying cries, is the redistribution of wealth amongst Bohemia. And they were pretty blatantly anarchical. They just wanted to incite sedition. I guess after the free love was over, it was time to do some fighting. So anybody that they could fight on behalf of the Taborite movement, they would do so. And so eventually the Taborites become a pox on the Utraquists themselves. And in fact, the Utraquists eventually began to sort of get in talks with the Catholic Church in efforts to try to figure out a way to deal with these crazy people. At the end of the day, the legacy of Jan Hus and the Hussites would be smaller if it weren't for the fact that in about 100 years after his death, and certainly within 100 years of the success of the Hussite League, you have arise the Protestant Reformation. That Luther himself, in 1519 at the Leipzig Disputation, decides to wrap his own Reformation up with that of Jan Hus. Notice he doesn't make any appeal to Wycliffe. The Lollards and the Wycliffe movement, as we've already seen, did not have the political strength and the effect that the Hussite League and the Hussite Church managed to achieve in Bohemia. And it is really because of the success of later Protestantism that Jan Hus and his image in the Hussite Church has endured in our minds, not just as an interesting theological radical during the Middle Ages, but in many ways as a forerunner to the Reformation.
Okay, I did not know that they were going to close with that. Let me do this. It's very likely that this is going into the next lecture that he's going to be giving, but I think you got the idea that it's going to have an influence on the Reformation that's getting ready to come about. One of the things that they mentioned there an awful lot was the Utraquists, okay, and we don't have issues about that. You see, Baptists, as a rule, they weren't part of the Catholic Church anyhow, and so they always just had communion where they had what would be both elements, the bread and the wine, and it's going to be unleavened bread and it's going to be unleavened wine. In other words, no alcohol in either to bake off or to evaporate off. Okay, but you might find yourself hearing in other kinds of church circles that where they talk about communion in two kinds, and that's the Utraquist thing, but you'll hear it more commonly around here, I think, as two kinds. The question was, should you have both bread and wine or just one element? And so the Catholic Church, as he said in the lecture, they felt like if you had one or the other, you were getting the whole community because Christ is present in them and transubstantiated. So it doesn't matter. There are certain things certain times today when the Catholic Church will offer the wine as well, certain select situations, but they're still doing it in one kind. And we don't even bother using one or two kind or utraquist. We just never thought about it. We just said, "Oh, we're having communion. You're having Lord's table today," and that's more common. Okay, let me ask: are there any questions that anybody has, Mr. Stanley?
Just a comment. I find it amazing back then that these people, instead of leaving his fate up to God,
Yeah.
stopping at, well, we deem you irrelevant, you're excommunicated,
Yeah.
be gone. They got to burn him. They got to kill him.
Yeah.
Killing. Why can't you just leave his fate up to God? Who appointed you, the keeper of life and death? Make the decision to burn somebody to death. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me make sure I'm doing what I'm doing. Okay. Yeah. You had this all goes back to that critical moment when Constantine sets up the state church. If you go back into the notes, you'll see it again where that was, it looked like it was a good idea. Yay, no more persecution. No. It just changed who was doing the persecuting. So now the church does the persecuting. This is why that American Revolution is such a wonderful time period that was so powerful, because that's where you had that great break. And that's why we would mark that time or run that time of the Philadelphian age of the book of the Revelation, where you had missions going out, you had like so much evangelistic work going out. And as you can even see on the bottom of the next screen here, you have the Magna Carta. That that's the dot that connects what happened in the American Revolution with this time period. You get the Magna Carta, and stemming from that, the influence of that comes down to us today. Now, I've read the Magna Carta and thought, yeah, this is really geared for that time period, but it was the essence of it, of power to the people and not to the political powers. That's the critical element for that. Yeah. Somebody else, Mr. Stanley again. Yes.
Just an interesting note. You mentioned about our revolution.
Yeah.
Interesting note that not many people are aware of. You have to dig a little for it. There was a turning point where General Washington, when all of his troops were starving and freezing to death, he came very close to just surrendering because he felt so bad for his men. And I think this is from the diary of an officer. Saw him before he made his decision. Washington walked away from camp into the woods to pray about it. And I mean, nobody was there with him, but it's believed that God showed him something because he came out of the woods and he was different. He was determined. He was excited. He rallied the troops. And in a major battle after that, he was on his horse riding back and forth, encouraging the men. And the British were firing, and not one round hit him. And there were some British officers that later were astonished that he just kept riding back and forth, rallying his men, and not one round hit him. They were stunned. So I I agree. I believe God showed him something when he went out to pray. You have to finish this. You don't understand. You have to finish this.
Yeah.
You can do it.
Yeah. There's so many things. I can't remember the details, but I know there's like bunches of details that says this was really of God. This was really of God to have happen. Um, I think that also when we see some of the reports coming out now, if you're going to have Mark Zuckerberg spill the beans about the tremendous pressure he was under to censor things and changing his model around from private fact checkers to community notes. Uh, this is a very telling thing. And when I look at uh, just all the things, they 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 spoke fast and furious and often about um, about truth and disinformation, and boy, does that come out as a pox on America. It was nothing than efforts at censorship. The question is, who are the truth checkers? Okay, who are the truth checkers that are able to do this? No, that is government censorship, and I hope there's just more revelations, and because there have been other revelations too. But yeah, especially with Zuckerberg doing that. Yeah. Somebody else here, somebody else from home. Miss Diane.
Pastor, in John 6:53 to 58, it does specifically say that Jesus said, eat of my flesh and drink of my blood. Not you over here can have this, you over there can have that.
Yeah, we have to add on, though I have to add on to that. That's true what you're saying. But I want to always quote the next verses later on, okay, to go with it. Because when you see the Catholics will say, um, they'll say that that means that uh, they can have transformation of transubstantiation into the actual body and blood of Christ. So what you're trying to bring out is that it's supposed to be two kinds, but let's remember that the Catholic Church also adds on transubstantiation with that, to which we go down just a few verses later. Um, Verse number 60, many therefore of his disciples, when they heard this, said, this is an hard saying, who can hear it? And this is where you now in verse number 63 get rid of the transubstantiation. Yes, keep the two kinds, but get rid of the transubstantiation. It is the spirit that quickeneth, the flesh profiteth nothing. The words that I speak unto you, they are spirit and they are life. So he adds on this explanation on top of it. Okay, it's not the transubstantiation, it's not the elements that quicken or make somebody alive, but that it is the spirit that does it. And if there's any doubt, the words that I speak unto you, they are spirit and they are life. So yeah, we whenever you use John 6, you have to you might have somebody come back at you with transubstantiation. So you got to go the other route too.